Welcome to the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast, a show dedicated to modern learning and development. With your hosts, Daniel Mendonca and Scott Babcock.
It's podcast day. Welcome to the show. This is If You Build It, Will They Learn? I'm Scott Babcock, and I'm alone today. There's just Sabrina. She's going to produce a little bit of the episode on the other side of the microphone, but I think she put herself on mute because she didn't want to talk today. So Daniel was unable to join us today. He is doing some construction work at his house, and he thought it might get a little noisy, and he would be poorly heard on the show. So I'm going solo. Dad is on the mics. The kids are off being put to work. That's the way it should be. So we're going to do a little something different today. We're going to have a little bit of fun. I'm going to tell some stories. We're going to talk a little bit. It'll probably be a short episode, hopefully, although I have been known to be called long-winded. So we'll just see how this whole thing pans out in the end. But so today we've been on a journey, if you will, on the whole concept of creativity. And I wanted to spend a little bit more time there today in a space where we've been talking about bring out your inner child. We've been talking about don't be afraid to break outside the box and the norms. Don't let physics hold you back sometimes. Turn the cardboard box into the spaceship, that kind of stuff. And the reality is all of those are tremendous and they're wonderful and they do great things for telling your story. But you also don't want to get too far down the creative rabbit hole where you start to lose some of the impact of your story. And we want to talk about that today. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into a quick story. And then I'm going to talk through why that story might have failed and some of the pitfalls that come with our normal training rhythm when we do those things. All right, so I'm someone who loves analogies and metaphors. I use them a lot trying to explain complex or what I think are sometimes complex processes and wanting people to relate them back to their everyday life. And I think we all do some version of this in our day-to-day. And so I'm really used to using that as my methodology for conveying a message. And I think we put a lot of that into our training as well. So I have a story that I want to tell. And then we'll talk about some of the places where it goes well and where it might fall off, and then how you can avoid some of those traps as well. So without further ado, here we are. I want to tell you the story of Herman the Ogre. Now, Herman the Ogre lives in a kind of musty swamp. He recently bought the place and he needs to renovate a little bit and he wants to spruce things up. He's got this swamp. It's kind of a mess. He needs help though, because it's a lot of work. And he thought, you know what? I've got some friends. I can probably ask around. And I'm sure they'd love to help me do hard manual labor, right? So he ventures out. He starts going door to door at his friends' houses and just knocks on them and says, you know, look, I just bought this place. It needs a sprucing up. Can you help me? So the first place he goes to visit Phineas the leprechaun. All right, and he knocks on the door, fitting as we hit St. Patrick's Day that Phineas would make an appearance in our show. And look, he says, Phineas, I know what you're good at. I'd love for you to come and help me clean my pond. And Phineas says, well, of course, I'd love to help out a friend. Is there anything I need to know? And Herman says, well, I mean, there is one thing. I need you to understand that the entire pond is full of dangerous snapping eels. And Phineas says, yeah, I'm sure I can figure that out. I'll probably just play them some music and they'll probably be calmed down and I can get that pond cleaned up, no problem. And Herman says, oh, that's great. I'll meet you there this afternoon. So he goes on to the next house and he sees Dominic the elf, right? And he knocks on the door and he says, hey, Dominic, long time no see. And Dominic says, great to see you. How's the new house? How's the new swamp? And Herman says, well, it's great, except, I got a lot going on. And there's some stuff that needs to be cleaned up. Could you help me out? And Dominic says, sure, I'd always be happy to help out a friend. And he says, okay, well, I need this dead tree cleared out. It's just kind of an eyesore and it's been dead obviously quite a while. Would you help me out? Chop it up and maybe haul it away. And Dominic says, yeah, of course, I'd love to do that. Yeah, no problem. Anything I need to know about the tree? And Herman says, well, I mean, it is 2020 and I do need you to know there is a massive hive of stinging murder hornets. And Dominic says, well, yeah, I mean, I'm fairly familiar with them, so I'm sure we can find a way to clear them out. No problem. We'll bag them up along with the tree and we'll move it all along. No problem. I'll meet you there this afternoon. And Herman says, great. See you then. So he goes on to the third house and he taps lightly on the door because it's a very small house. And he says, Penelope, are you home? And Penelope the pixie comes to the door. And Herman says, oh, I'm so glad I caught you. And she says, how are you? How's the new swamp? And he says, well, it's a mess, but I've already got a couple of my friends willing to help. Phineas and Dominic. Can you come help me as well? And she says, I'd love to help a friend, of course. And so Herman says, all right, so the thing I have is this wonderful garden path that I want people to be able to wander down. But it's starting to get some weeds creeping in at the edges. Would you help me put boulders around the edging to help keep the weeds at bay? And she said, yeah, that sounds great. And he says, well, I should tell you, though, I know you're fairly small as a pixie is. Uh, these boulders are at least twice your size, and they might be really heavy. Is that going to be a problem? And she said, no, no, no. We'll figure out something. I'll bring a cart or whatever, and we'll figure out a way to get it done. And Herman says, that's great. Everyone's coming over this afternoon. Let's go to it, and I'll see you then. She says, great, I'll see you then. So the afternoon comes along, and Herman and his friends get together at the swamp. And Phineas goes ahead and he clears out the pond. He plays the music for the eels. Dominic goes ahead and starts chopping up the tree. He figures out how to get the murder hornets out of there. And Penelope, through a lot of ingenuity and innovation, she moves the boulders along and makes a beautiful edging to the garden path that they can all walk down. Herman thanks his friends and they all go home, and everything ends up just great. Herman enjoys his new swamp. He invites his friends over regularly to hang out, and all are happy and merry as they go along in their lives. Now, this story is obviously well written, and I can only imagine I am up now for many, many literary and maybe a poet laureate award of some kind, I'm sure. Hopefully, though, you see some problems in the story itself. Beyond obviously the wonderful naming convention and some of the nonsense, some of it is exactly what we've been talking about. The idea of being creative. We've built up a fantasy world. We've included mythical characters. We've given them tasks, and they're with some crazy obstacles, perhaps, that they need to do. And we've been a little ingenuity wise thought through some of this and made it kind of fun and playful. These are all great things. They tell a great story. They help paint the picture of something fun. But what you might have noticed that many great stories have, and this is missing, is there's no conflict. There's no reality or no realism to the conversation. Everyone just says, well, sure, I could get an arm bitten off by these snapping eels, or go into shock because I've been stung by these hornets, or I can obviously lift these boulders that are twice my size without any problem. And everyone just accepts it. Now that in and of itself sounds great, and obviously there's a lot to be said for friendship and perseverance that might be told from this story in a child's fairy tale. But if we think about how we carry this forward to training, we're going to find those pitfalls, and let's talk about that next. All right. So when we think about training, we often write a training narrative that isn't all that different than the story of Herman and his friends. The reality is that when we write these, especially when we think about things like sales training or potentially even handling of hazardous materials or something that's maybe compliance driven, we always assume the best possible scenario. We want to tell people how to do it exactly right without any errors. I see this a ton in the sales training that I have built in the last couple decades, and we often say, "Oh, you'll go and present this to customer A. They'll obviously be completely ready to buy this. You'll wrap up the sale and send them on their way, and all will be happy and merry." And typically, what I run into is whenever we roll that training out and we actually put it in front of a sales associate, their first response is, "Yeah, that's never the way it happens." And the reality is that's true. We rarely think of an interaction with anything, whether you've been the customer or whether you've been the salesperson. When you have that interaction and they say, "Hey, would you like to buy our warranty, or would you want to get the accessory package that goes with this? Would you like to opt in for XYZ mailing list," whatever it is, your first response is, "I don't know about that." Now, sometimes it makes a lot of sense and it's exactly what you need. Sometimes it's going to be an option that you're really interested in, and you may just say instinctively yes because you have familiarity with it. But often it's immediately seen as, well, there's just more cost to that, and maybe I'm hesitant because of that. And I think as a customer, that's normal. The reality is, as a salesperson, you have to be prepared to deal with the idea that your offerings, your services, your products aren't just gold. People aren't going to just readily accept it every time, and you may have to overcome some objections. So in that same story where Herman tells Phineas that the pond is full of these dangerous creatures, but he really needs him to help out, Phineas probably is going to say some things like, well, what do you know about them? Can you help me understand how I might overcome the danger in this notion so that I can help clear the pond? Or Dominic might say, do we need to also hire a hornet specialist to come in, an exterminator, or an entomologist who understands insects to come in and help with that part, and then I'll do the tree after. They're often going to ask questions, and realistically, that's normal in that explanation. And ultimately, those are the things we also need to train people for. The problem is, it's really hard to write for all of the circumstances that could play in when you're thinking about any interaction you're going to have. Customers will come up with crazy questions. The system may act in a certain way that just is abnormal, and they may get an error that you can't always predict. Some of these things are normal, and the training would end up being 40 minutes long if you tried to embrace a lot of them. But it's important to get the sales associate or the person who's going to be working on the process or the system to understand there's ways to apply things they've learned, to think creatively in their own sense. We've talked about the idea of bringing your learners' creativity to play, or just to get them starting to think about, I can start to work through problems. I think if you set the tone that it's not always going to be roses and unicorns and rainbows, they'll start to understand, like, I'm going to have to think and improvise during my sales because it will have some difficulties. There will be some objections I've got to overcome. I may have to do some research to understand error codes in the platform I'm trying to train on. What if the bucket has a hole in it that I'm supposed to be doing cleanup in? How do I resolve that? Where do I get additional supplies? Helping your learner understand that they have to think creatively and they have to adapt a little bit in those ways, I think is a great way to approach the training and to really try to bring your message around, but allow the user to put themselves in a way that they can see it as reality. So if we add those elements to our creative story, we both get the advantage of a fun story, an interesting read, a parable or a moral to that story that helps them understand how they need to think differently. But they can also start to apply it in their real life, and they can see those interesting parallels back to the way they do their job or the people that they interact with. And they'll start to remember those elements in ways they have to be creative thinking forward. I think as long as we take those things and put them into play, those are great ways to think about your training. Remember to keep realism as part of it. It's not always going to be yes, yes, yes. Sometimes there's going to be a no in there, and we want people to think about that so they're not just assuming it's always going to run completely smoothly every time. All right, just because I'm alone doesn't mean I'm not happy. I still have a positivity point for you today, and I will share it with Sabrina and Daniel as well offline. However, I want to share with you, the audience, today. It wouldn't be a traditional podcast if we didn't include a positivity point at the end. So here we go. I want to include my wife on this one, and I know it always gets me brownie points, which is a good thing, and makes Daniel get put in the doghouse. See, he's not even here, and he's going to end up in trouble. But no, my wife, two things. Number one, today she gets to go back to the office for a day, which I know for her is something she misses a lot. And so I'm really happy that she gets a chance to go and interact a little bit, even if it's in small scale, with some of her coworkers. So she's enjoying that. Now, with that, she's also doing something else. So she started this week making the family think more about the way we eat, and she's taking on a bit more of a wellness journey of her own, which is a bit more rigorous than what the boys and I are willing to take on at this point. But with that, we're eating a little healthier, we're making some smarter decisions, and I will say kudos to her because she's actually persevering through all of our complaining on why can't we eat more chicken nuggets and ice cream and cake, and why do we need to have more vegetables. I can internally mentally grasp why it's important, but it just never tastes as good. So and the kids obviously don't get it at all. So but despite all of that, the kids are actually doing a nice job of muscling through it. There have been some gagging faces on the idea of eating zucchini, but all in all, they're doing it. And more importantly, my wife has embraced this, and she's persevering through even us giving her a hard time. And I'm super proud of her for that. And the journey she's at least helping us take on, even if it's only maybe 50% of the time. So I really appreciate that. And it's made us all think a little bit differently for a few days. And hopefully we start to carry that throughout the rest of the year. So super excited for that. Also motivated, internally by watching Daniel, who's on his own journey of health and wellness. And so all of these things are combining to hopefully keep us healthier and more energetic and everything else. So that's my positivity point. Hopefully today's been a fun, different kind of experience in our podcast. A nice short one for you today on a Thursday. We will be back with a special guest next week. Very excited about that. I will leave that as our trailer and our tease for next week, that there is someone special coming to join us as a co-host. Daniel will be back. But that will do it for us today. I'm Scott Babcock. Sabrina's in the background waving, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the If You Build It, Will They Learn podcast. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. Join the conversation by emailing us at podcast@haylight.com. Find us on social media at Build It, Learn It, and be sure to check us out on the web at www.haylight.com. That's HALIGHT.com.